Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So last time we finished up by talking about a couple of reasons why we might oppose free trade, both having to do with market failure events. So we want to go through several more, some of the more popular other arguments about why we might be against free trade and supporting some sort of a trade barrier against imports. So the next argument that we often hear is what is known as the so-called dying industry argument. And in this case, what we typically see is an industry that has come under import competition and is beginning to shrink. Now, of course, this is exactly what we would expect to happen in the industry once we open it up to international trade, right? If you don't have a comparative advantage in an industry, that's an industry that's going to shrink in terms of output and resource usage, and presumably you've got other industries in the economy, including those where you do have a comparative advantage in international trade, that would be expanding both output and resource utilization. But the argument in the dying industry, or the substance of the dying industry argument, is again that there's something special, maybe something extra special, about the production or the employment or the other resource utilization in that particular industry. Now, this may sound like one of the arguments that we talked about last time, but the argument has a particular twist to it. And the argument is that with this import competition, one of the possibilities is that the industry will collapse. Not just shrink in sort of a normal adjustment process over a number of years, but that the industry itself will actually collapse. And that collapse of the industry could actually lead to some negative externalities. Now remember, one of the things that we talked about last time is the argument that increased economic output, because we have a tariff in place, would also lead to increased resource utilization and generate marginal external benefits. So this is a similar argument, but it actually is the argument in reverse. Rather than trying to capture positive externalities by expanding production, we want to avoid negative externalities by not having production collapse or shrink. So that would be an argument that not only can be used, but has been used quite often. And the biggest part of that argument is when we have resources that are being used in the industry that cannot be quickly redeployed. So what we might be talking about here is specific factors of production to an industry where the period of time for which they are specific is quite significant. We're talking about multiple years, maybe even 10 or 15 years, as opposed to a matter of months or quarters or maybe even a year or two. So what that would tell us then is if the resources can't be moved to the other industries, we already know the rate of return to the owners of those factors is going to get significantly reduced, and we will actually end up with underutilized resources. So in some sense, we'll be operating inside of our production possibilities frontier. There's a second category, other than sort of specific factors that can be used here, and that is what happens if the industry is geographically concentrated. That is that, think about a company town, or what we used to call company towns. If you're having a company town is a place where there's one major employer, and they employ 40, 50, 60% of all the workers in the area. So what happens if that business goes out of business? Right? So all those workers get unemployed, so no longer do they go down to the diner or to the restaurant. They don't shop nearly as much at the corner grocery store or the Five and Dime. So you get that multiplier effect of the whole town going down. Now, what if this town is relatively isolated? That is, if it's 20 or 30 or 40 miles to the next town. Now, this is not all that atypical in many parts of the country, in the Midwest, in the North, as well as in the South and the Southeast. You often have small towns that have one or two predominant employers. So if you lose your job in one of those industries, or now all of a sudden somebody decides they don't need your capital equipment anymore, there are no other jobs, right? If the factory closes and there are no other major factories in the area, you're out of luck unless you move. But we're not talking about commuting, losing a job in San Francisco and finding one in San Jose and being able to do that commute, because that's not the kind of areas that we're talking about. We're talking about the kind of areas where you've actually got to sell your house. But remember, half the workforce is unemployed. Don't think your housing prices are going to do really well. And you've got to find a job someplace else, and you've got to have the financial resources to actually make that move. That doesn't happen very often, so the resources get stuck in place in that geographic region. And now the labor market, and maybe the capital and other resource markets, become what we call congested. We've got too many people looking for too few jobs. And so the unemployment rate or the return on capital in that particular area, whatever it might be, has a tendency to fall. Those can become very, very significant negative externalities. Remember, when people don't work and home values fall, they also don't pay taxes. So now the local government doesn't have as much money. So now they start laying off school teachers and class sizes get bigger, and the unruly kids take over. Right? And now the quality of education goes down, and more kids begin to drop out. And now you got too many people hanging around on street corners rather than being in school. That actually does happen, but I know that's a little hyperbolic there. So, but you also see that now all of a sudden, we don't have enough money to maintain the highways. So potholes don't get fixed. Sidewalks crumble, and they don't get fixed. The public infrastructure begins to deteriorate. And what you find in these particular areas is the towns just get worse and worse and worse. And think about people who can't make their mortgage payments anymore. Now their houses go into foreclosure. Now this is something that we're witnessing on a national scale right now. But we're finding in many communities where foreclosures go up, it drives all property values down. Not just those who can't make their mortgage payment anymore, but all of their neighbors. And now all of a sudden the community is not looking nearly as attractive to a potential buyer. And you get into that kind of downward spiral. So what you can have here is a huge marginal external cost that's being imposed by having a contraction in economic output. So here, let's do this a little backwards from what we did before. Here what we're going to say is, let's suppose that we have a tariff in place. Right? So we've got our tariff in place. So we're already at S1 in terms of our output of the product that we're talking about here. And we're all still capturing the marginal external benefit. But now, one of those free market economists, international trade economists, from one of those free market schools, comes into town and says, or goes to Washington and says, you know, we shouldn't have any tariffs at all. The free market will give us a much, much better solution. And so the legislature in its infinite wisdom says, oh, that guy makes a lot of sense. Let's get rid of this tariff. So what do we see? So prices fall, and we can look at what happens to the welfare effects. Now, the price falls, but notice also that the quantity produced domestically declines, the quantity demanded domestically increases, and our imports go up. This is M naught, so the naughts and the ones are backwards here, right? So we can think about the sort of standard analysis here, right? Consumer surplus goes up by A, B, C, and D. Producer surplus only goes down by A. Tariff revenue goes down by C. And so if that's all there was to it, what we would see is that, oh my goodness, we get benefits. We recapture the production and consumption distortions. So by getting rid of the tariff, we're essentially getting to a much higher level of economic welfare, or much higher, maybe a stretch, but a higher level of economic welfare by increasing or getting rid of the production and consumption distortions. But notice that we've also got this decline in economic output, the amount that's being produced over here. And so if we've got this marginal economic benefit curve, notice that it's a benefit when we're moving in this direction. It actually is a cost when we're moving in this direction, or fewer benefits can be thought of as a cost. So now we're going to lose area G. So now we lose area G, and when we think about the net, yes, production and consumption distortions went away, but now we have this loss of those marginal external benefits that we had previously. In other words, we're incurring some cost to society by not maintaining production or employment or other resource utilization at that higher level. And so we need to think about those kinds of spillover effects, those kinds of externalities here. So if this were the case, and in fact, if G was going to be significantly large, that is, we would lose a lot of marginal external benefits, one could make an argument that a trade policy would be a second best policy, because the first best policy of a free market actually generates a lower level of economic welfare, because we have externalities involved. However, we also know from the specificity rule that we talked about last time that it would actually make more sense to attack this problem directly. If there's something extra beneficial about a higher level of economic output or a higher level of employment, then we should subsidize that directly, rather than trying to subsidize it indirectly through trade protectionism. If we do that, we still have the production distortion, but we would lose the consumption distortion. And of course, we could still maintain all of our marginal social benefits. So that gives us another way of thinking about how we can make an argument for trade protection. Now, if this is a small country, as we've been looking at all of this, just to keep the analysis simple so we don't have to worry about trade, in terms of trade, the tariff may lead to a net loss or a net gain. Again, it depends upon the size of the marginal external benefits or the marginal external costs. No matter what you do, however, you will end up with a redistribution of income. Okay? So this is basically the same graph that we used last time to show what a production subsidy would look like. And I understand that in some of your discussion sections, maybe all of your discussion sections, you've actually talked about export subsidies. We haven't talked about export subsidies yet in class. We will after the exam. Okay? So what I want you to think about is a miscommunication on my part with the GSIs. They thought I was not going to talk about export subsidies at all, and they assumed you really needed to know that. Well, their assumption was right. It's just that their timing was wrong. So we will get to export subsidies, but we're talking about import limiting trade barriers for now. So if there's something extra beneficial about having output at S1 rather than S0, then the easiest way to get there would be, as we saw last time, to subsidize that extra production. This gives us three areas. So if we thought about the change in consumer surplus, there would be none. If we thought about the change in producer surplus, there would be A, area A. And if we thought about the change in the government revenue, it would be minus A minus B. So on our simple analysis, the only loss would be our production distortion. But now we also get our marginal economic benefit back. So we've got G. So this will be much less costly in terms of economic welfare to the country than would the tariff itself. Now, this is the second time I've made the argument that a production subsidy is actually more economically efficient than using a tariff when you want to maintain a higher level of economic output, employment, or other resource utilization than what the free market would generate. So why doesn't the government do that? The government almost always will opt for a tariff import quota type of protection in this situation than an outright production subsidy itself. Now, there's generally two broad thoughts about why that's the case. The first is subsidies are hard to maintain over time. Remember, a subsidy is an actual outlay of government expenditures. So it's in the budget every year, which means that it has to be voted on every year, which means, of course, the beneficiaries of the subsidy, the business firms here, or the employees, if it's an employment subsidy, have to spend time and money lobbying every year to get their particular subsidy renewed. But in the political process, you see those expenditures. They're right there in the budget. A tariff, on the other hand, or an import quota, is really very hidden. Once we put the tariff in place, prices adjust. We know that. Prices will go higher. But the tariff rate's in place. The next year, it doesn't have to be voted on again. The year after that, it doesn't have to be voted on again. It just stays in place until it's repealed or changed. So the beneficiaries would also prefer a tariff or an indirect subsidy as opposed to a direct subsidy. Now, obviously, the second main reason for tariffs over subsidies is that tariffs raise revenue for the government. Subsidies cost the government expenditures. So since most governments don't have enough money to spend anyway, or at least the politicians don't think that the government has enough money to spend anyway, as opposed to the taxpayers who generally think that they have too much money, you always run into this issue that, again, there's a bias towards trade protectionism that will generate a revenue stream rather than a direct production subsidy, which would actually cost money. Now, it turns out that in this particular case, most governments, including in the United States, do have some sort of assistance for resources to move from the dying industries to the expanding industries. In the United States, this is called trade adjustment assistance. So it basically gives you a cash payment and some vouchers for food and housing, but for retraining purposes and for relocation purposes. So you can move out of the depressed area to an expanding industry. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well for a number of reasons. One is we don't spend very much money on it, so much less than what the size of the problem would require. Second, the hurdles for getting trade adjustment assistance are fairly steep. What you have to show is that, yes, you lost your job because of foreign competition, as opposed to changing productivity in the industry or changing taste and preferences amongst consumers or any of the other reasons why jobs get created and jobs get destroyed. And third, it only covers manufacturing. So if you work in a call center and your job gets outsourced to India, call center employees are service sector employees, so they're not even covered under the trade adjustment assistance. Trade adjustment assistance. So we got all sorts of problems with that. But let's move on. Let's not belabor the point. A fourth argument that's been made, and what I believe to be the most valid of the arguments for trade protection, is what we call the developing government, and I left out a word here that actually turns out to be critically important. It's the developing government revenue problem. The developing government revenue argument. And basically what this argues is for non-resource rich developing countries, that means developing countries that aren't sitting on a huge pool of dead dinosaurs or other sort of mineral deposits, that the market failure is that the government doesn't have sufficient revenue to provide an adequate supply of public goods. Roads, schools, public health, sewers, all the kinds of things that most of us take for granted. So if that's the case, one way to raise revenue in a developing country would be have a tariff on imports. That additional revenue can then be used to provide an expanded menu of public goods to its citizens. When successful, that will also, so notice that there's a marginal external benefit there, right? Those public services, public expenditures on public goods is providing services to the entire population that are, generally speaking, greater than the dollar amount that's actually being spent. So that's very favorable. And when the money is spent in that way, so that's a positive, by the way, for the country. So it's very likely that the developing countries, economic welfare is going to be raised because the marginal external benefit is much greater than the production and consumption distortions. The second factor, though, is developing countries who use their monies in this way often have a tendency to grow faster over time. And so as the economy grows faster, income per person in those countries rises, and they then have a better opportunity to develop along the lines of comparative advantage, to engage in international trade, and to increase the world economic output and welfare. So this is one of the few arguments for trade protection where we can actually show that we can raise national economic welfare with a tariff, and we can also raise world economic welfare with a tariff at the developing country. Now, having said this does not mean that every developing country's tariffs are spent appropriately. We have plenty of examples where developing country governments have put on tariffs, the money comes into the government, and quickly gets moved to a Swiss bank account. And so it's just as easy to squander the money and do something non-productive, in which case, of course, there would be no or very little marginal external benefit. And there would be no or very little acceleration in economic growth. So it's possible to do it the right way. Doesn't mean that it will be done the right way. And so that's one of those things that needs to be kept in mind. Now, most of the other arguments for trade protectionism are not strictly economic arguments. They're typically non-economic arguments, but that doesn't mean that we can't look at those arguments with an economic eye and with the logic that we know about economic welfare and what happens to economic welfare. So one of those sort of non-economic arguments is what has been referred to as the national pride argument. So what this says is when we produce a certain good, this is who we are as a country. So we feel better. We have national pride in having this industry, maybe because we've had this industry for a really long period of time. And so we associate our country with these kinds of products. Now, I know you're all thinking, that's the silliest BS I've ever heard. You know, who does that? Well, let me just give you a few examples. France and the wine industry. I don't know how many of you have ever been to France, but if you go to France, one of the things that you will find, no matter where you travel in France, they are very proud of their wines. They have very good wines in France. They also have, by the way, some really awful wines in France. But one of the things, though, is that the French government has actually imposed trade barriers, both import quotas and tariffs, on the importation of wine into France. Because the wine industry is French, and we take great pride in making the best wines in the world. We just wish that the French would also stop making some of the worst wines in the world. But, you know, what can we say? So the French are very proud of their wine industry, and they've actually undertaken trade protection to protect it. Another example, Italy. So Italy has trade barriers on shoes and on leather goods. Some shoes I know are made out of leather, but not all. Not all leather. Some shoes are made out of leather. Not all leather goods are shoes. Okay. So we put on trade barriers because the Italians think of the shoe industry, especially the upper end shoe industry, as this is Italian. It's Italian fashion. It's Italian shoes, right? And in fact, Italy also has some